Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Office 365 from a hacker's perspective webinar. My name is Vlad Catrinescu, and I will be your host. We have a lot of amazing content planned for today by our guest speaker, Ben Menesi. How are you doing, Ben?
Hey Vlad, thanks for having me. Hope I'm muted.
Oh,
Looks like it.
no, I can hear you, so it works perfectly.
Perfect.
Great. Just before we get started, three housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded, so if you ever need to jump off for whatever reason, we are recording this, so this will be sent to you within 36 hours after the webinar ends. The slides will also be shared with you, so if you ever need to go look back at them, something like that, we'll share those with you. And lastly, we have an amazing expert here with us, and we also want you to ask questions. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A button. Please ask those questions, and we'll do our best to get to all of them during the webinar, but don't be shy. You don't get an access to an expert like Ben every day, so please ask any questions you might have. And this is it for me. I only took 4 minutes of your time, Ben. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks Vlad, and yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Welcome everybody, and thank you for taking the time out. Even though I guess we're all kind of stranded at home, so we thought, might as well look at an interesting subject like security that gains momentum every single day. And so far, it's looking pretty good from a Microsoft perspective. At least, the player that's in the news the most is Zoom for now. So we'll talk about security here, and I wanted to give you a quick intro also on where I come from. So I actually started out in the IBM world back in the day, and I've been working with a lot of enterprise customers around collaboration. I work as VP Products and Innovation here at Panagenda, where we focus on Teams and Office 365 analytics. This is kind of my day job, and at night I'm also a certified ethical hacker. Also studying for the OSCP right now. That's the Offensive Security Certified Professional, one of the most fun exams that I have ever looked at. Essentially, you get some material that you need to go through, but then you also get a VPN access to 250 machines that you get to break into. It is amazing. I can very much recommend it. I've done a number of offensive security engagements, including penetration testing, security audits, and all of that. Including Microsoft environments as well as Office 365. So we'll look at a couple of actual hands-on scenarios, and I have a couple demos for you guys here as well that we get to look at today. I wanted to give you a little bit of an intro and background on our company Panagenda. We're headquartered here in Austria, Vienna, but we've got offices around the world from Australia to Boston, Germany, and the Netherlands as well. Interestingly enough, I used to live in Montreal for the past 10 years, so I just very recently moved back to Europe. So kind of Vlad and I have met each other a couple times over there as well. What we do, and I promise I won't make this a marketing session or anything like that, but I think what we do is extremely important, especially these days, is Teams Analytics. We look at all the possible APIs, we gather usage data, and we basically manage the twofold problem that we see with usage data that comes out of the box. A, we gather this data for as long as you want it, so it doesn't just go up 28 days. And B, we combine it with organizational context, and we deliver insights both at our Office Expert portal as well as directly within the Teams client, so you can turn your Teams creators into true owners of the collaboration that happens in their teams. We've got a free offering here for a month where you get to install this in your environment. So I'm going to show you guys a link at the end of the presentation. Feel free to hit me up, and I promise I'm going to stop right here so I won't talk about our product anymore in this presentation. So having said that, let's take a look at what we'll cover today. Security is a huge subject. So obviously we could talk for an entire day, about all the defensive capabilities that are in the box as well. I'm going to take a little bit of a more practical approach and talk about, some of the things that offensive security people like myself would look at and use as a vector to get into Office 365 environments. We're going to get started with talking about ransomware. We'll then move on to a little bit of email security. We'll talk about illicit consent grants, as in tricking people into authorizing third-party applications without leaving the Office 365 tenant. This, in my opinion, is the biggest bottleneck there is. It's not only at Microsoft. We see the same thing with Facebook, with Cambridge Analytica, but we'll see how this works live. Then we'll talk about multi-factor authentication, which is always an elephant in the room, and then finish off with attacks and password attacks and stuff that hackers would actually use against real environments. Now, this is a pretty interesting presentation. I've done this a couple times and it always changes. It's actually kind of painful because security evolves so fast that every time I do this presentation, even if it's been 2 weeks only, I usually have to get rid of like 20% of my slides because, you know, they're not relevant anymore. In any case, please ask questions as we go on, and I'll try to address everything at the end. Now, I love numbers. We're an analytics company, and numbers are actually really awesome. I'm not sure if you guys ever looked at Verizon's data breach investigations report. This is a report that comes out every single year. They analyze a huge amount of incidents, so over 50,000 incidents and data breaches. So I've looked at a couple of interesting numbers here that I think will be a little bit surprising just to put things into perspective. When it comes to security incidents and breaches, we usually think about the likes of Sony, right? The ones that really make it into the news. But as it turns out, about 60% of the victims here that Verizon investigated were all businesses with less than 1,000 employees, which means that the majority of targets are actually SMBs. So we're not really safe when we think about these breaches. It's not just a danger to these larger companies. Definitely we need to pay attention even if we work for an SMB. The other thing is that something that we could possibly suspect, but it didn't really change, is that about 92% of the malware that gets installed is installed via email, right? Whereas web is only 6.3% and other things 1.3%. So definitely email is still the vector that we need to pay the most attention to. And this is a really frightening figure, which is that 68% of the breaches that Verizon investigated took months to discover. And actually, there is another number that I didn't put in here, which was the amount of time that it took for the victim to actually patch those vulnerabilities once they were discovered. And that was also in the somewhere 4 to 6 months. So that means you know you've been breached, you know that there is a vulnerability, and it still took months to patch these issues. These are really scary numbers. Now, another thing on phishing, because we know that email is extremely important, I've looked at Avanan's Global Phish report, where they analyzed over 55 million emails. And then there's another report that I've taken here as an example as well. One of the interesting things here is that about 1/3 of the phishing emails that they have analyzed have managed to pass through Exchange Online Protection and landed in the recipient's mailboxes. Yeah, so we still need to educate users and not just leave everything to Microsoft for protection. The other thing, this is super scary, is that 43% of the branded phishing emails out there impersonate Microsoft, making Microsoft the most impersonated brand out there. There is some good news here because at Christmas time, apparently Amazon takes the lead for a couple months there, but still, it's something to really take into consideration. 90% of the emails are after malware, installation, or credentials theft, so that's an important thing for the intentions. And 1/3 of the cases where a breach has actually occurred, the first thing that the attackers go after is the Office 365 account. Yeah, so Office 365 is definitely in the center of everything when we talk about security today. Now, I want to talk a little bit about on-prem versus cloud security. When I do this session, I usually ask for a show of hands, but we can't really do that here, on who's already completely in the cloud and who's on-prem or who's in migration. What I'm finding is that the larger the company, the more they're still in transition. So I want to talk about a little bit of on-prem versus cloud security. Now, there are definitely a lot of benefits of hosting your data in the cloud with a provider like Microsoft. First of all, you get a much broader scope of threat intelligence. They'll be able to monitor and have the teams to really see, major campaigns like SamSam or NotPetya or stuff like that. The other thing is that you get a larger and much more specialized security muscle than most SMBs can afford. What I'm seeing is that up to maybe up to 1 or 200 people, you will have an IT department with maybe 1 or 2 IT folks that are wearing all the hats there are. But you need to be a corporation with over maybe 500 to 1,000 to actually get dedicated IT personnel, or that's what it looks like in general. And you need to be in the couple of thousands to actually have a blue team and a red team. Now, the beauty of working with something like Office 365 is that you get all of this, even if you're just a shop of 20 people in total. And then the third part has to do with one of the figures that we talked about, which is that you don't need to patch anything, right? So Microsoft is going to do all of this for you, and I think this is one of the major advantages of having your data in the cloud. Now, I'll be honest with you, I think there are some disadvantages of using cloud services as well. First of all, the vulnerability and risk mitigation is out of your control. So if there's a 0-day, there's nothing that you can do really unless there is a specific workaround for it. Because you use Office 365, you're part of probably the hottest surface for attackers that everybody is looking at, trying to find 0 days, etc. So you're definitely not secure by obscurity here, right? And the third part is that it's usually with cloud services, you get a little bit less of a wiggle room to customize your defenses. And we'll talk about this in a little bit later. I see that this is improving a lot lately, though. Now, an example of some of these points is the base striker attack. This is something that was discovered back in 2018 and essentially had to do with the ATP safe links feature, where the idea was that every incoming email is inspected by Microsoft and they will check where that URL goes, much like VirusTotal does. But the thing is that with a usual URL, what it looks like is you've got an href tag that points to the actual URL. Now, as it turns out, there is a technology that allows you to actually split the base of the URL from the rest of it. And as it turns out, this was reported back in May 2018 by Avanan, is that the ATP SafeLinks feature did not manage this particular base technology, so they would not be able to really inspect that link in these cases. It sounds like a really stupid little thing, right? It sounds like a really simple thing to fix, and still it took 14 days for Microsoft to fix this. So this is what I'm saying, is that vulnerability mitigation is out of your control. These things happen. Interestingly enough, it took 14 days. Probably we would, if this wasn't for Microsoft to fix, but the actual customers themselves, we would probably still have this issue out there, a couple of customers that didn't patch it. So this is not bad, it's just something to keep in mind. Now, let's talk a little bit about ransomware. So why is this an important subject? I usually ask for a show of hands and get just a couple of really shy hands in the air. Who has ever been hit by a ransomware attack? I actually have, so I've seen this live as well. According to the DOJ, they monitored around 1,000 attacks a day in 2015, and it has actually quadrupled by 2017. When you look at some of these major campaigns that we've all seen, so WannaCry, NotPetya, and you look at the monetary losses here that are just for WannaCry, they raked in around $4 billion in total, right? It's insane. So when you look at Merck's, they've had a major issue with NotPetya. They actually had to fly a private jet down to some country in Africa, actually, to get a copy of a domain controller, because otherwise they were completely destroyed, and fly back to the UK to rebuild the environment. So ransomware is extremely important. Now, how do these ransomware campaigns spread? Most of them actually come from infected emails. As we know, email is a very important vector, but you also need to pay attention to your cyber hygiene. Because as it turns out, this was the city of Atlanta back in 2018. They got hit by a campaign called SamSam, and they actually very publicly declared defeat, right? As it turns out, the malware found its way into their environment using an on-prem web server that had SMB version 1 open. Yeah. So even if you're in the cloud, this doesn't mean that you don't have to pay attention to all of your equipment that is still on-prem. And the aftermath was pretty staggering at $2.6 million. Yeah. Now, the other thing, and this is more of a funny story, was with a company called Harrington Company. They got ransomware, and of course, what's the first thing that you do is you start looking for companies offering data retrieval or data recovery, right? So they they ran a POC, which was really fast. The guy did something in the command prompt, whatever, and they ended up paying this company to recover the data. They got their data back. But there was a federal investigation that followed, and as it turns out, the data recovery company just ended up paying the ransomware, the ransom, and got the data back that way. So while there are some community efforts out there, so it's definitely worth doing a Google search for some of these major campaigns, because there was one very recently where they actually found a way to activate a kill switch in the software, and this was a community effort. All of these things are usually free, so don't pay for this kind of stuff if you don't have to. Now, how do we get protected when it comes to Office 365? I have to say that what Microsoft did here is extremely elegant, and it just works. Essentially, when you get ransomware, what ends up happening is your files are encrypted, their signature changes, and so essentially what they did was they allowed this backup and restore capability up to 30 days. Now, one of the other things that Microsoft says is that they're also monitoring when changes occur to your file inventory, your assets. I did not find this to be true. It was a while ago when I actually tested this. I use this free software called Encryption that essentially just allows encryption of files, and what it does is you provide a password and they will encrypt the files and change the extension of these files. I ended up encrypting all of my files stored in OneDrive, and I have not heard a peep. So this was a while ago. They might have fixed it. Supposedly this is supposed to work. So let's hope that it does. It's just something that I would keep in mind. Now, the email section of this presentation was usually pretty huge, but a lot of this stuff works really well ever since. So the email encryption is one of those subjects that we've been dealing with for more than 20 years or 30 years by now. Essentially, the issue that we always had was, with emailing externals and sharing those keys to be able to encrypt and decrypt messages. I really love what Microsoft did here, because essentially what ends up happening here is that the recipient will just get a notification of the email that they received, but the email does not actually leave, the data does not leave the perimeter. So with OME, that is automatically enabled. You can now encrypt and set emails to not forward, etc. And one of the great things about this, which is thanks to my friend Albert Hoiting, who is an MVP around security that we co-presented with a couple times as well. One of the great things here is that we know we can revoke messages internally, right? But this never really worked externally. But now, because the email does not actually leave the perimeter, you can use PowerShell to grab that message and actually revoke it. Now, what ends up happening is you don't revoke the message per se, but you actually break the link to the data. So whoever clicks the message in their inbox at an external party will basically see that the message has been revoked by the sender. Yeah. So because the data never left the perimeter, it's really the link that you break with revoking these messages. So this is awesome. Now, this is where the bulk of this presentation lies at. Like I said, I want to look at third-party applications and what we can do with them here. This all comes from an attack that was demonstrated by Kevin Mitnick, who I still get the shivers when I say this, because he is like the idol of everybody that works in security. I think he's the guy who coined the expression hacker and also went to prison for it and now works as a security consultant. We all know Cambridge Analytica, and we all heard about what happened at Facebook. Essentially, it was all thanks to an application that was registered with Facebook being the identity provider. Now, the Azure AD supports all of this as well. And the issue that we're going to look at here is how easy it is to trick users into consenting to applications they don't know what they're doing or what they're actually giving out as access. Now, it's kind of the same issue as when you download a flashlight application on your Android phone, or this was the case a couple of years ago, and then it asks for your photos and private photos and all of your contacts. Why, right? So let's take a look at what we're going to do here. The exploit scenario will have a hacker that tricks the user into consenting to an internal application without trying to clone a login page or whatever, and then forwards the details, the authorization details, to a Node.js Express server that I just installed locally. So let's take a look at how this looks like. I'm going to quickly pull up the email that my user received. So this is the email that my user received. Actually, all of this did not take more than 2 minutes for me to recreate. I just grabbed one of these automatic notifications. I sent it out from a mod administrator account from a different tenant. It needs a little bit more tailoring so that it goes to the right user and uses the right credentials. So essentially, I've got an end user that actually happens to be an administrator too, and I can see that there's a user that was flagged for risk. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my Node.js server that is essentially a reverse handler here. So we're going to start listening locally, but this could actually happen on any web server out there. So the user clicks on users flagged for risk and is then logged into the account. The next thing that happens looks a little bit weird, and this is where somebody that's a bit security savvy would probably catch this. I could have made it a little bit more convincing instead of unverified, but it kind of looks right. Yeah. So Azure AD Identity Protection Preview, it looks like it doesn't need much. I just hit accept, and then what happens here is essentially we're redirected to the right place. I don't see anything else happening here, and I'm looking at my users that were flagged for risk. Now, at the same time, what ended up happening is we just almost completed the OAuth 2 authorization sequence, which I have forwarded to my local machine without the user ever realizing. So I'm going to copy this part of the code, and I'm going to finish the sequence by putting in the authorization code here. And we just got a graph token. So I'm using Microsoft Graph here. I'm going to grab the token. I could have automated this a little bit more. And I'm going to use Postman to see what we get here. So the user never really realized what we did here. I'm going to go for an interesting URL that allows me to go for all of my users at first. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put in the header, which is going to be the bearer token with the graph token that we just received. I'm going to hit send. And we just got a list of all the users in that particular user's tenant. So what we're looking at here is we're essentially looking at that tenant from these users' eyes on behalf of this user because the consent happened and we managed to catch the authorization code. Now, there are a lot of nasty things that I can do here, from listing out all of the SharePoint sites in that tenant as well. So now I can start going through all of them and see if I've got credentials to access any data. I can access the users drive items or pretty much anything that we have access to here, from groups to users and all of this. Yeah. So we've got a ton of access. We could actually start encrypting the user's emails, what Kevin Mitnick actually did. We could send out emails on behalf of this user to other users and start pivoting in the organization. Yeah. So that's the quick demo. Let's take a look at what actually happened here. So we received a legit looking email. It was actually much better than what you see here. The user clicked on the link, picked an account, basically consented to the application that we registered. And then this was what Kevin Mitnick did, which is of course kind of just a show-off thing, is to to encrypt all of the emails because you can always get them back. But basically, there's a lot of possibilities you can do on behalf of the user once you grab these credentials. So let's take a look at the infrastructure here real quick. Essentially, I've got my hacker here that created a rogue application in the Azure AD. Now, this is an application that used delegated permissions and sent an email with the consent link to the user in a different tenant. Now, these applications can be made multi-tenant, so the user consented to it, logged onto the Azure AD, which in turn provided an authorization code that was forwarded back to the hacker, in our case to the Node.js Express server that was listening locally. Now, with the way that OAuth 2 works is we just grabbed that authorization code and then acquired the Microsoft Graph token from the Azure AD, which we could use to gain access to the tenant of that user and access all of their SharePoint site collections, list of usernames and basic user data, etc. Okay? So this is where I kind of said that it's a bit like a digital Me Too era, in that consent is key today. And I think we're starting to realize this more and more. Having said this, integrated applications like the rogue application that we just registered here are not a bad thing at all. You can use various APIs. There are a lot of APIs, including Microsoft Graph, that are extremely valuable. In fact, our solution uses one of these applications as well. And then you can gain access and do better things with the user's data. So these are legit ways of getting access to tenants. And because the Azure AD provides this secure sign-in and authorization, it looks like an extremely secure way to go. However, your users need to know what they're consenting to, and they need to be trained to understand what this interface means, right? Now, there are a bunch of issues with these applications. Not just the fact that it's so easy to trick someone into consenting to something like this. By default, anybody can register applications in your tenant, any simple user without any administration roles. So we'll talk about how to prevent this. I've got here the authorization flow for OAuth 2 and OpenID. So essentially, it's a twofold process. It goes against the authorized URL to gather the authorization code, and then it goes for the token that will allow the application or the third party to access the tenant based on or on behalf of the user. So basically, what is it that we can do to prevent this? Because this is a pretty tough issue. It was first demonstrated by Mr. Mitnick about 2 years ago, but I could still recreate it today, right? So it hasn't really been fixed. Let's see what is it that we can do here. First of all, we can restrict application registrations and consent. The second point is we can actually enumerate the applications and permissions that have been consented to by our organization. The third point, and this is the biggest one here, is cloud app security, and of course, educating users. So let's go into some of these points real quick. First of all, you can restrict people from registering applications in your tenant. This is definitely something you should do. It's on the Azure Active Directory portal under user settings, and you can quickly prevent people from creating application registrations. Why is this a good idea to do? Because with the user that I just got access to, I could have actually used the graph to create another application that is within this tenant, and then maybe trick people into consenting to this application within the same tenant. So this is definitely something that you want to consider. And while we're at it, why do people need access to the administration portal? This is also something that's enabled by default. So I think that it's a good idea to completely restrict access to the admin portal, because even as a simple user, you can see a whole bunch of information from license assignments, whatnot. There's no point in allowing users to access the admin portal unless they have special administrator roles. The next thing, which is more important, is restricting access, restricting the consent grants to these applications. Now, there are two kinds of permissions that you can assign to applications. One of the kind is the one that we used in our demo, which are basically more low-level permissions, where we actually work on behalf of the user. So we won't be able to access the full details of every user in the tenant, just the basic details. Now, out of the box, as a simple user, I can consent to a third-party application to allow the application to access the tenant through my identity. Yeah. So these are the low-level permissions, and there are application permissions, higher-level permissions that you can actually consent to, but those need global admin consent. So you need to be a global admin to consent to them. These are permissions that allow the application to, for example, go through everybody's OneDrive directories and whatnot. So we're just talking about these smaller, lower key permissions, and these are something that you can turn off. So you can actually disable users' consent abilities to these lower key permissions. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that a lot, and actually all of the ISVs and all of the software that you're using within Office 365 as an add-on will use these applications. So when you disable user consent, it means that your global admins will need to give consent to every single type of permission. So it can actually put a load on your global admins. And what I'm seeing is that the larger the company, the less global admins they have. So this is just a consideration to keep in mind. Another thing you can do is, of course, you can use PowerShell to enumerate the applications and permissions that have been consented to. Now, my previous organization where I worked, we had around 20 people in total, and still when I went with this particular PowerShell script, we got over 550 different lines in this Excel report, which is extremely hard to really see. And one of the problems is that it doesn't show the redirect URLs. So it doesn't show you where the application forwards the authorization data. Yeah. So in our case, with our Office Expert client, Office Expert solution, what the solution is it's a virtual appliance that you can stick into your own Azure instance. So we don't actually have any access to customer data. And our Azure AD application that you need to register in your tenant will have the redirect URL that goes directly back to the virtual appliance within your Azure instance. Okay. So that's why it's important to look at all of the applications and where they forward the data, because you might find some surprises here where they're hoarding your data out of your tenant. And you can do this with the Azure RM.resources. This is how you get the actual redirect URL for applications. Of course, you can also search your audit logs, but audit logs are event-based. So what you're going to look for is consent. However, it might not actually show you the real situation, because what you're going to find is when a consent was given, that consent could have been revoked in the meantime, and you won't really know because you don't get an up-to-date information about that. The best way to go about it is Cloud App Security, though. So you go to portal.cloudappsecurity.com, and here you can create OAuth app security policies. Now, what these work, the way that these work is basically you define a bunch of conditions. It's a little bit like Flow. In this case, you could select what sort of permissions you want to be on the lookout for. Then the key condition to use here is the community use does not equal common. Now, this is a lot like antivirus solutions, right? They're going to flag executables as potentially risky or dangerous if they don't see it in the wild. As an ISV and a product guy myself, this is a major pain for us. So we have to contact all the AVs out there before we have a major release, as you can imagine. And if we don't do that, all the AVs are going to start catching all the stuff that we're doing because it hasn't been seen very frequently out there. And so the beauty of these OAuth app security policies is that you can create notifications and alerts here should you meet an application that was consented to. However, keep in mind that it might actually be too late because the attacker might already have the data. So by the time you get this notification and act on it, you might be in danger or exposed already. And you can actually be a lot more draconian about it as well. So you can actually instruct Cloud App Security to completely revoke the app right away. Again, there are things to consider here because if you do this, chances are that you're gonna get some false positives and they're gonna be revoked immediately. So just consider, the amount of applications that your organization consents to. It's a good idea to run the PowerShell script for enumeration quite frequently to see if this is a frequent scenario in your tenant, and then decide upon Cloud App Security. But this is as close as it gets for a real solution or resolution of this issue. This is what you would have gotten actually from the attack scenario that we did. So we can see that the application was actually caught by Cloud App Security. And of course, it could have been revoked immediately, in which case I would not have been able to list all the users or the SharePoint sites in the tenant. All right. So I'm going super fast. I'm just going to pause here for a second to see, but I don't see any questions right now. Vlad, have you seen anything else out there?
No questions yet. I think a lot of people are like, wow. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, please ask them now. I mean, you still have 25 minutes, but ask them this way we get all of them answered.
Absolutely. So that means I'm either doing a really good job or a really bad one.
That's what I'm saying. Maybe it's too early for everybody from North America. They need more coffee. Oh, there we go. There we go. That call, there it is. That call to actions worked. So first of all, a question from Edwin. Actually, what is Cloud App Security? Can you do like a elevator pitch for what that program does?
So Cloud App Security is an additional offering on top of everything. I'm not sure, Vlad, do you know if this is above E5, right?
P2, I think. So you need to have P2. Azure AD P2.
So it's a little bit more extra, but it knows a lot of things. Like my favorite stuff is these rules and the OAuth 2 security. So that's what I use in Cloud App Security. Is definitely something that you want to check out. It's an amazing solution. I think that they just started doing endpoint security with that as well. Do you know anything about that?
Sure, no. The only thing, and something in addition to what you said that I find really interesting, and I'll just explain it a different way. And I mean, you're the expert. Tell me if I'm completely wrong. But basically, Cloud App Security will analyze all of the network traffic that goes through your firewalls,
Yep.
and will also allow you to identify the different applications that are used. So you can actually see, hey, the marketing people use Dropbox a lot.
Yep.
So you
A little
can
bit of shadow
actually,
IT management as
yeah,
well. Yeah,
you,
yeah,
you
yeah.
can actually, it has a bunch of rules built in, like Ben said, that will see, okay, this is Dropbox, this is Google Drive and things like that. So you can find shadow IT in your organization
Yep.
without like asking users. You can just see the traffic go through, which is crazy.
And as far as I understand it, actually, there is some endpoint management here, and that is how they know that shadow IT is being used. So they will know like what sort of tools you're using on your endpoint as well, which is pretty awesome. Yeah, and then there's another question here, which is the token hijacking. Do we have to have full control of the user's machine? That's not what you need. Actually, you just send them a link that needs to be customized to that user. So it needs to go into, for a specific tenant, it's something that you could potentially automate, but it needs to be customized for the target tenant, for the victim's tenant, and it's just a link. So I could send out a quick email to someone with the link and then trick them into clicking the link, and that's pretty much it. You do not need to have any sort of access to the user's machine.
Awesome. Let's continue
All right.
on, and then we'll
Okay.
get to
Okay.
the end to the other questions.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So I only got like 50 more slides to go, guys. So yeah, we got we got a little bit more here. So let's talk about password attacks. Now, one of the things that's really sad, I mean, for me, for myself anyway, is that brute force attacks are not very effective against Office 365, and this is the bread and butter of everybody that works in offensive security. Because the thing is that you get shut down, and brute force attacks are actually, there are multiple kinds of attacks here. We've got brute force attacks where you define the character range of the passwords that you're looking for, and then you're going against them systematically, you know, trying every single character. So of course this requires that you can unleash some tools that come with Kali, for example, the Kali Linux distribution, and then try, you know, tens of thousands of passwords every single second. Now, this does not work against Office 365 because you get shut down and locked out after every 10 unsuccessful attempts, okay? So this does not work. However, there are some issues in Office 365, and this was actually something that came out in 2017, where they have noticed, this came out on Tripwire, a sophisticated attack that is now labeled as a password spray attack, where they knew what the threshold was. They never tried more than 10 passwords for a single account, so they kind of flew under the radar and went against a number of Office 365 customers looking for basic accounts like support@company.com, you know, sales@company.com, and then trying basic passwords or all the same passwords for these different tenants. So you've got 100,000 failed login attempts from different IPs, different networks. It was slow and low, and it was actually fairly successful. So this is still something that you need to keep an eye out for. I've had a demo here, but I don't have my Kali machine here. Kali Linux is a distribution that a lot of security guys use, and there is a tool in there called the Harvester that actually allows you to go through, you know, just put in the domain name, and it will go through LinkedIn, Twitter, as well as Google to actually get you a list of usernames and people that work at that company and their email addresses, because that's one piece of the puzzle. You need to know those email addresses so you can start attacking them with passwords. So it's extremely easy to get a list of login names and email addresses out of specific companies. The less information you disclose online, and that includes putting email addresses onto indexed pages on your website, for example, because that will be picked up by Google. The less information you disclose, the better. The account lockout feature in Office 365, like I said, is awesome and extremely effective. However, the issue here was that you did not have any customization capabilities. So after every 10 unsuccessful attempts, there was a CAPTCHA, and after another 10, there was a lockout for 10 minutes. So there was nothing you could have done here. If you're running an old people's home, for example, and they all have Office 365 accounts for whatever reason, and your personal preference is to increase that number because there are more people forgetting passwords, this was not something you could do. But in 2019, so actually about a year ago, they introduced finally the custom smart lockout capability here, so you could actually change these thresholds. So this was really, really cool. This is what I meant, that they're actually going towards making all of these things more customizable, more tailorable, even though it's a cloud service provider. And newish attack/vulnerability, because, and I don't know if you guys follow security. I love the Hacker News. The hackernews.com is, I think, the best website that really aggregates everything that's new in vulnerabilities and breaches and attacks. If you follow them, it's kind of a scary thing to follow every single day, because you get breaches and attacks and exposures every single day. Large companies out there that get hacked, etc. Now, this attack here is called credential stuffing, and the idea here is that people reuse passwords, right? So people reuse passwords, and so if there was a breach for Sony, for example, so for example, all the PlayStation data gets out, and that could be just the usernames and the password hashes, but still, you could find a lot of email addresses and the corresponding password hashes, which then you can start brute forcing locally, because you don't need the cloud provider to actually brute force a hash value. You might actually get a working username and password out of Sony's data. Now, if I look for that specific user in another provider, chances are that they're using the same password here, right? So enforcing unique passwords for the enterprise is, of course, impossible. And the way that credential stuffing works is that they will look for a specific company, for example, let's say google.com. So I'm looking for somebody at google.com in one of the breaches that came out. Now, all of these data dumps are available on the dark web, as well as thanks to our friend Troy Hunt, and we'll talk about that in a bit. You'll look for specific accounts in a larger breach that were breached belonging to a specific company, and then you actually have the password and username combinations that you can then start using against Office 365. So the problem with this is that the attacker only need one single attempt for a successful intrusion. Of course, only if MFA is not enabled on that account. Now, according to Cloudflare, they've seen these kinds of attacks at 0.1% success rate, which sounds pretty weak, but if you think about it, that's for every 1 million login attempts, that's 1,000 successful logins, which is a major issue. So how do we prevent this credential stuffing attack from happening in our organization? First of all, multi-factor authentication, right? So multi-factor authentication, even if I have the username and password, it will prevent the attacker from successfully entering my account. The second thing that Cloudflare is pitching is that you're using some bot management systems. It's kind of like an IP reputation database, so they will rank IPs and basically kind of filter out the domains that they don't trust from doing login attempts. This is usually extremely expensive, and I don't find it to be very precise. And the third point that you can do is due diligence in the breach data. And this is where use MFA and definitely regularly scan these breached accounts. So do your due diligence. How you can actually do this is there's a Microsoft MVP and regional director called Troy Hunt, actually out of Australia. And sorry about that. I heard a podcast episode where he talked about haveibeenpound.com, which went viral. It's huge. It started out as a project for him to play with Azure data and larger data sets. And he was looking for some data sets, and one of the possibilities was hacked accounts, so breached accounts and password hashes. And so he started uploading them, and this became a service that actually contains almost all of the breached accounts and password hashes on haveibeenpound.com. It's actually awesome because you can go in there, put in your email address, and he will show you if that email address has been breached in any of these larger breaches that are known, as well as you can put in your password independently from your account or your login address, and he will tell you if that password has been breached during any of these breaches as well. Now, they offer an access to their API, which I just happen to be paying for at $3.5 a month, which is nothing. And using a REST API, you can actually quickly retrieve the accounts that belong to a company. So it's super easy. haveibeenpound.com/API version 3 breaches, domain equals something. And then you just put in your API key. Look at the security guy disclosing his API key. Geez. Yeah, I should have blocked that out a little bit. And you can analyze your results pretty quickly. So I just look for adobe.com, and then you'll see if there's any email addresses from your company's domain that were breached during any of these breaches, and you can reach out to the users, have them change their passwords, essentially. So let's talk a little bit about MFA. Of course, this could have stopped everything. There is, however, an interesting story about MFA. This was on Twitter. I'm not sure if you guys can see it. I sometimes have issues with this as far as displaying the image, but essentially this came from Twitter, and the guy gets an email, gets a text message, says, hey, I know you don't know me, but many years ago I used to have your phone number. I'm trying to log into an old account. This is the phone number that I need to use for verification. Would it be okay? Then the guy says, okay, thank you so much. And out there, that was MFA. That was the way around MFA right there and then. Now, I thought that this was kind of a joke / urban legend / maybe it might happen if you're looking at a very targeted attack. But I was doing this talk at an event in Toronto a year ago, and then two guys in my presentation actually put their hands up and said this happened to them last week. So apparently this is something that tends to happen. So this is why a good idea is to use the application for the sign-in approval. There's no real way around this as far as we know, and it's definitely more trustworthy than relying on text messages. Then, of course, there's the elephant in the room, which is that MFA is known to have had some outages in very recent times as well. And this, of course, has the byproduct that sometimes even your admins get locked out. So for this reason, it's a good idea to actually implement something called like break glass account. So if everything goes south, you still have an exclusion baseline MFA policy that allows you to have one MFA non-MFA enabled global admin account with an extremely complicated password. So just in case of these issues, so you still have access to a global admin account. I've had several customers that had to go hours and hours without any global admin account during some of these outages. Now, this is the really scary stuff. So we think that MFA is really unbreachable or unbreakable, but as it turns out, there were ways around MFA. Now, this came out in early 2019. It was discovered by Proofpoint that basically there were a bunch of methods that you can go without going through MFA. For example, think about your email client, right? There is an authentication taking place via IMAP, but you do not get an MFA prompt every time that your phone syncs with the server, right? So what hackers ended up doing was they ended up using insecure old applications and protocols to target users and running brute force attacks because these protocols were not protected by the MFA. Yeah, and then they actually managed to get in using once they found the password, because all of these methods were not protected by any of the brute force or against brute force mechanisms. So this came out, and when Proofpoint discovered this, they've seen 100,000 unauthorized login attempts. About 72 of their tenants were targeted at least once, and they had almost a 50% compromise rate. So this was extremely, extremely successful. Now, what Microsoft said to this is we still need to use MFA, so use MFA everywhere. They started blocking clients that don't support modern authentication. One of these protocols is going to be the basic authentication for Exchange Online right now, and they introduced the app passwords that we all know in Outlook now as well. So that's an additional layer of security, which is great. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of these attacks. How do you simulate this stuff against yourself? This is actually available as part of the Threat Intelligence and Protection Center available in Office 365 Enterprise E5. So if you're a global admin or a member of the security admin group, you have access to this. And what they did is they actually gave you the tools to the most frequently used attack tools, that is spear phishing campaigns, password brute force attacks, and password spray attacks. Now you go to protection.office.com, threat management, and that's where you've got the attack simulator. The first thing that they allow you to do is they allow you to simulate phishing campaigns against your own people. So you select a bunch of users, and then they even give you default content that you can send out, such as some bogus HR email that goes to a domain that is owned by Microsoft, and they're monitoring who clicks the link, they're monitoring who puts in their passwords, and you have a dashboard at the end that shows you how many of your targeted users fell for it. You can even send them to a specific page after that where you kind of, you don't have to antagonize them, but you have to kind of warn them that they would have been hacked if this was a real scenario. So this is pretty cool. The issue with this is when this came out, I started playing with it right away, and in just about 2 days, Google already started flagging these by default Microsoft sites. So this was one of them, payrolltooling.com, that was acquired by Microsoft and that was used out of the box. Do not use the out of the box pages because they're flagged as deceptive sites. So this won't be a realistic result, but you can actually create your own sites, and they're really simple to do. You just clone the Azure login page or Office 365 login page, and you're pretty much done. Now, you've got the brute force capabilities here as well. However, and there's a link here for you guys, and like we said, the presentation is going to be uploaded soon. There's a GitHub account that we like to use that has all the common credentials, and you can actually get the top one, I think it's either 10 million top used passwords at this GitHub account. So this is the stuff that hackers use when they're brute forcing something offline. I just started using the brute force capabilities here with 10K passwords. I did not manage to actually upload the 10K text file with 10,000 passwords. So I went at it with maybe like 500 or 1,000 passwords only. And the interesting thing is when I selected my users, I uploaded the text file. It did not really work very well because as we were doing the attempt, Microsoft locked themselves out every 10 minutes, the same way that we would be locked out at false password attempts. So it did not work very well. I'm not sure if this has been fixed in the meantime, but what you want to use more is the password spray attack capabilities. So this is the ability to use a smaller set of passwords against a larger set of accounts. So for example, if your company is called Acme Corporation, you want to use, you want to try passwords like Acme Pass or Acme Password or something like that against a larger set of accounts, just to see if anybody's using that really stupid password. Now, one thing that I like to test things, and when they don't work, it's kind of funny. I did a test here with this password spray attack, and I set 2 accounts to the exact same passwords, but only one of them came back as a positive. And I didn't understand how that's possible because I knew that both of these accounts had the same thing. And as it turns out, one of the accounts was MFA enabled. And so when I was doing this password spray attack, it did not manage to circumvent MFA, but it did not trigger an MFA prompt either. So for MFA-enabled accounts, this stuff does not seem to work extremely well unless they fix something in the meantime. Then you've got the threat tracker, and this is amazing. So there are major campaigns that are ongoing, much like coronavirus itself, but in the digital space, when you've got NotPetya and all of these larger ones that we've seen out there. One of the great things about it is that Microsoft has this telemetry where they're looking at all of their tenants, and they'll be able to profile these attacks pretty early on. They'll be able to let you know how you're impacted if you're impacted at all. So this is also pretty cool stuff. Then there is the Secure Score capability, which is a little bit similar to what we just talked about with the attack simulator, where the attack simulator is a way for SMBs to kind of get a penetration test without having to pay for one, or, well, you're technically paying for it because you're E5. The Secure Score is a little bit similar because it's like a way to get an IT security audit without having to get auditors. So it's securescore.office.com. It has a bunch of pretty cool recommendations and things that you can do. However, I would also take this with a grain of salt. It currently looks at 77 data points around applications, data, a lot of device management and identity. These are the focus areas as far as products go. Not very long ago, there was no Teams-related intelligence here at all. So there's a bunch of stuff that I'm missing here. And the thing is that I'm saying you need to take this with a grain of salt because there are things like having a break glass account, right? One global admin account without MFA, this would be flagged as an issue by the Secure Score. There are no team suggestions. However, I think it's great to have some baseline security recommendations. Definitely worth checking out. Now, one word about Office 365 passwords, and just trying to be mindful of time here because we're running out a little bit. I'm a cryptography geek, and that's a little bit my background as well. I couldn't help but notice that when you generate passwords randomly for users, it kind of seems to have a pattern here, right? So when you're looking at the current password format, it looks like as though they want it to be easy to remember. So when you look at the possible combinations here, the random passwords are always 8 characters, always start with 3 letters. The first and the third are always consonants. The first is always a capital. The third is always a lowercase. And in the middle, you've got a vowel that's always lowercase. Then you've got numbers. So you've got 5 numbers that creates a total amount of possible passwords at 220,500,000 passwords. Now, this sounds like a big number, but in terms of cryptography, it really isn't. And as it turns out, as part of the Kali Linux distribution, you've got a tool called Crunch, where you can input these password rules and actually generate every single possible random Office 365 password there is. And it only takes about an hour and creates a file that is about 1 gigabyte in size. Now, why is this an issue? Currently, we don't know of any ways to really brute force Office 365 accounts. But if you think about the way around MFA when this wasn't fixed yet, so if you could go around, MFA or Exchange Web Services or whatever, then you actually now have a file that you can use to brute force any Office 365 account. And if they have a random password that was set for them, you're going to get in. Now, this is just something interesting because I'm a data geek. I would recommend that you let users create their own passwords themselves. And as a bit of a conclusion here, I would definitely use the tools out of the box. These are great. Simulate your attacks against your environment. Play around with the attack simulator. Keep an eye on for more tools to come in this regard. Use your own phishing tactics and word lists. You've actually got external providers for phishing as well. And I think this is a very effective way to really raise awareness of your users and, of course, educate your users all the time. Now, having said that, like I said, we've got this offer right now that is a month evaluation of our solution in your environment. If you guys are curious about who's using Teams for what, feel free to hit up panagenda.com/Office Expert Sandbox, and we can reach out and get the install done for you guys. And feel free to actually get in touch via Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever, and Vlad is going to actually upload this presentation. It's been a pleasure to have you guys here. I hope you enjoyed the session. Let's take a look at some questions and see what I can answer.
So we got 3 quick questions here. I'll start with the easy one. And
Okay.
this one is kind of the perfect world versus reality. Wouldn't the user notice that the URL is different? You see what I mean?
Yeah, I
Perfect
do.
world versus reality.
In a perfect world, they would. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, the URL wasn't that different. So it actually goes to the Azure AD. So you're staying within the Office 365 environment. I mean, I imagine we're talking about the scenario that we looked at, right? So the reality is that you don't go outside of the tenant. So it's still the same URL. You stay within the organization. What you need to know as a user, but this is where I don't think a lot of users are educated on this, is what it means to consent to an application. So that's my answer there.
Awesome. Now another one on cloud app security. Is cloud app security quick enough to block new events? My experience, and just reading from the attendee, is that through ongoing events, it does not always display all of the information from events. So I wonder if at the time there's effective blocking going on.
I can only speak for the particular scenario that we looked at because I have tested that inside and out, and I found it to be quick enough, and I found it to be working. So I got the block on the application. So for the OAuth 2 security policies, one of the issues where I can agree with you is I've run into some issues around the conditions. So I needed to test some stuff out because there are 3 possibilities, for example, for an OAuth 2 policy where you can set the permission levels to low, medium, and high, and that's really not tangible if you think about it. So you don't really know where the application is going to belong or what the rules are there. So a couple of cases where I thought the policy was not effective. It just didn't catch my application because it was flagged as a different level of severity for the OAuth 2 policy. So I think what's important to test out properly is the whole conditions that you're setting. And other than that, I found it to be extremely reliable and fast.
Awesome. And there's a last comment at the end. There's plenty of breach data from users registering with with company emails also.
That's precisely what I mean. What I mean. So if I have, I work at Panagenda.com. I actually went ahead and searched through haveibeenpound.com for @Panagenda addresses because yeah, you're right. People do register with their company emails. It's pretty nasty when you leave the company because you have to go through all the stuff that you registered for with the previous company. I just had to go through that not long ago. But yeah, that's exactly what I mean. And so chances are that registrations with your company email and the password you use are going to be the same that you use at your own company, right? So now you've got the data. That's exactly what credential stuffing is about.
Yeah. Awesome. And one last comment from Donna in the chat. One of the best webinars I've seen. So thank you very much, Ben. And Rogers as well in the questions. Just a big thank you. Amazing job,
awesome.
Ben.
Thank you so much.
This has been really informative. And as Ben said, thank you everybody for taking an hour out of your day. We really hope that we're able to show you stuff, and make sure to connect with Ben on Twitter, on LinkedIn. He's an awesome fellow, and always, well, mostly I'll say, just not to give him too much credit, mostly shares interesting stuff. There we go.
You're awesome. Thanks for having me, Vlad.
Thank you. And like I said before, I'll send everybody the recording within 36 hours. You will get it by email. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great one. Bye-bye.